Bible entrusts to the parents the primary responsibility for discipling their children in God's truth. One important aspect of that truth is God's good design of sex and the world's distortions of it. And whether we're prepared for it or not, our children are forming an understanding about sex. Kids will seek out information to help them in their understanding, or oftentimes that information will seek them out. Therefore, we must be proactive in helping our children understand and embrace God's truth in regard to sex. I want to encourage parents to aim to be the first voice and to continue to be the prominent voice on the matter of sex. Now, this provokes a lot of fear in parents, fear of inadequacies, fears you consider maybe previous failures, fear of not knowing what to say or maybe saying too much. And for many of us, that talk we had with our parents either didn't happen or it wasn't all that helpful. Acknowledging these fears, I want to encourage you, do not shy away from discipling your kids in the truth of sex. It's created by God and it's a good gift from Him. And here's the reality. Our children are being raised in a sexually saturated culture. And so it's important for us to be the leading voice in our children's lives. Now, each family is different, whether your child has access to the internet on devices such as an iPhone or an iPad, whether your child is in public school, private school, or being homeschooled, whether your child spends a good amount of time with older kids. I mean, there's so many factors in play here. Each family is unique. So I want to encourage you to do what is best for your family, but doing nothing won't work. So here's a few principles to consider. Have the talk sooner rather than later. I believe from the youngest of age, we should be talking to our children about their bodies and how God has created them for His glory and for their good. Helping them at the youngest age understand modesty and how to honor God with their bodies. Teaching them the importance of keeping private parts private. All of this should give solid ground for you as the parent to then have an age-appropriate talk about sex. I recommend in our day, in our culture, to have this talk at the age of 7 or 8. Some families might push back and say that's way too early. Maybe so, but I've seen all too often Christians' parents are coming in too late rather than too early. So I encourage parents to wisely seek to be the first one to talk to their child about sex. And if you miss that opportunity, it's not too late. You should seek to become the prominent voice in your child's life. Secondly, I want to encourage you to have the talk in a familiar space. Some suggest you take your child away for a weekend to a special place to have a special conversation. However, having this conversation is already going to feel uncomfortable and it's going to be a bit awkward. I recommend having this talk in a space that's familiar so that it's not seen as some special conversation that only happens when we go to a special place, but a normal conversation that should happen throughout the lives of our children growing up. Having this conversation in the living room or at the kitchen table should set the stage for an ongoing conversation where you don't have to travel to some obscure place to continue. Rather, you can continue as you're driving down the road or sitting in your living room or in their bedroom before you tuck them in at night and pray over them. Have the talk in a familiar space. Next, have the talk and center it on God's good design for sex and introduce the world's distortions when age appropriate. The sex talk is not a one and done event. And there's so much that our children need to know and to grow to understand, even process through in God's created world that's marred by sin. God has called us parents to make disciples of our children. And parents, one talk about the anatomy of mankind and how babies come into the world is not sufficient to disciple your child. What I recommend is first having a conversation about how God created our bodies. Go to Genesis chapter 1. Explain the difference between the body of a man and the body of a woman. And then have a conversation about how God intended for man and woman in the context of a marriage relationship for those bodies to come together in the act we call sex. Now, you could read Genesis chapter 2 here where God says, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Explained. I mean, this is a God-glorifying thing. It's a deeply intimate act. It's not just a physical act, it's a spiritual act. And it's intended to bring a lot of joy to the wife and to the husband. And it's even God's way of populating the earth. When you have properly explained God's good design, it's then necessary to have a conversation about what God created for good, the world distorts, and those distortions will harm us and harm others. At an age-appropriate time, it's important to discuss sexual sin like premarital sex or adultery, pornography, masturbation, polygamy, rape, and incest. Explain as followers of Jesus, we must flee these distortions so that we can live as God intended. Explain as sinners, God's grace is able to redeem and restore those who have sinned sexually. Then I encourage you, keep the conversation going. There's ample opportunities to continue the conversation as you're driving down the road, listening to songs, as you're watching a movie in your living room, as you're walking through the mall and images are there as you walk through the halls. Do not shy away from these conversations. Disciple your kids in the truth that God created sex and did a good job.